Okay, so let's talk about plate tectonics. So, one of the first things we need to kind of set straight are the layers of the Earth. So, here's our Earth. In the center, we have the inner core, we have an outer core, and then we have a pretty thick mantle, and we have a very thin outer crust. So this very inner layer is the inner core. It is solid and it is made out of iron and nickel, which are the two magnetic metals. And then the next layer is the outer core, which is a liquid, also made out of iron and nickel, but in liquid form. And this part's important because as the Earth is spinning, the liquid portion is kind of sloshing around while the solid portion is whirling around, and this creates a giant electromagnetic field. So the Earth is really a big electromagnet. And that's important because it makes this field and it actually protects us from space debris and solar winds and other harmful things that could come to our planet. It kind of deflects it off and around. So kind of a big deal. Okay, the next layer is that mantle, that orangey layer. And the mantle's kind of weird because it's sort of solidy, liquidy, depending on pressure. And if you've been in preschool and they have that white cornstarch stuff, oobleck, and you push on it, it's a solid. But if you let go, it liquefies. That's pretty much what's going on in the mantle. The pressure of the crust is keeping it solid inside. But if the crust breaks for some reason, volcano, earthquake, then this mantle will ooze out onto the crust and we'll get lava and magma. So the crust is divided into two types. There's continental crust, the land, and there's oceanic crust, the ocean one. The oceanic crust is mostly made out of a rock called basalt. And since the ocean is salty, that's how I remember that it's the basalt rock. The continental is usually granite or quartz, sometimes silica. Okay, let's see. Another little clarifier, I guess. So in these notes, O is going to be oceanic, C is going to be continental, EQ will be earthquake, VOL will be volcano, and MTN is going to be mountain. That way I don't have to write all of those big long words all the time. Okay, little tiny history lesson. Alfred Wegener was a scientist in the 1800s. He studied maps at first and he noticed that all of the continents look like they are little puzzle pieces that could fit together if we push them all together. And that led him to the idea of Pangea. Maybe the world was one big continent at one time. So he looked for evidence of this. Another piece of evidence he found were mountain ranges in South America and Africa matched. The rock structure, the pattern of the mountain range matched up when you pushed the two continents together. And that happened also in North America and Europe. These mountain ranges, if you push the continents together like a puzzle, seem to be continuous, same composition, same height, same shape. And so that was another piece of evidence. Another evidence he found were different fossils of plants and animals on different continents that don't swim or fly, but they matched up time-wise and shape-wise and species-wise. And so to him, how else would they have been related to each other so far away unless the continents were closer together? And his last piece of evidence was a climate piece where he found evidence of glaciers in deserts, which is weird because that's a hot/cold opposition. And he also found evidence in Antarctica of coal. And to make coal, you need a hot, swampy area. So that tells him that where the continents were currently located, they weren't necessarily always located there. So that led to his theory of plate tectonics. And he presented all of his evidence, and all of the people said, "That's great, Alfred, but what is the mechanism? What's making these plates move around?" And he didn't have an answer, so he died trying to find his answer. It wasn't later until technology helped him out that the answer is mantle convection. So this mantle swirls around, hot rising, cold sinking. And as it's doing that, these plates are breaking apart and they're moving like on a conveyor belt. So if we look at the ocean floor, this lava is coming up and this mantle is moving like this, and it's spreading the seafloor apart like a conveyor belt moving along something. So this technology later on helped us learn that yes, the plates, the continents are moving due to this mantle convection. So Wegener did get his mechanism. Okay, so then they realized there's 3 types of plate boundaries. There's the kind of boundary that separates, there's the kind of boundary that passes by, and there's the kind of boundary that collides together. So the separating boundary is called divergent. It's a divergent boundary, spreading apart. So di is to split apart, dissect, divide, divorce, go away from each other. So one kind of boundary is an ocean to ocean boundary, and that is called the mid-ocean ridge, which is kind of pictured right here. And that is also called seafloor spreading. And literally, that is where new crust is formed. We get new crust formed. So it's nice, thin, new crust of the earth. And so this lava comes out, it hits the ocean water, it cools and it solidifies, and it spreads apart at this divergent boundary. So the mantle's down here, and our seafloor is spreading. Here's our seawater up here, and we get this boundary. Now, what happens is over time, let me make this brown, this lava comes out and it cools and it kind of builds up. And the seafloor is only spreading at the rate of an inch a year. So that's the rate our fingernails grow. So 24 hours a day, all the time, this lava is coming out and cooling, and the plates are only moving about an inch a year. So you can imagine this lava comes out and it cools and it builds up 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 and it builds up. And we actually have these giant sea mountains underwater that are bigger than Mount Everest. So one of the landforms we get under here is this mid-ocean ridge, which is huge mountains, bigger than Everest. Okay, and we also get volcanoes because lava's coming out, and we also get underwater earthquakes. And when we have underwater earthquakes, we also have tsunamis. Hi. Okay. The other kind of divergent boundary is continental to continental. And when that happens, the land kind of sinks down and we get this valley. And if it spreads enough, we will get some lava going on. So we could get definitely earthquakes and we could get some volcano activity. There is not an ocean to continent divergent boundaries. Ocean to continent are always convergent boundaries for some reason. Okay, the next type of boundary is this transform boundary. And the transform boundary is when the rock slides right past each other. It grinds on past. We get really big earthquakes. I'm making this big because they're huge earthquakes. And we have a very famous transform boundary in California, the San Andreas Fault. We get no lava, no mountains, no volcanoes, no. What happens are the rocks, the plates, just grind on past each other. And they're held together in a locked fault, held together by friction until the force of friction is overcome by all that potential energy building, and then the rocks move, and that movement's the earthquake. Okay, and then our next one is the convergent boundary. I like to squish it together to show it's getting squeezed. So the convergent boundary, when we talk about two pieces of ocean colliding, one of them is gonna sink below the other, and the other one's gonna kind of buckle up, and we get what's called an island arc, which is basically how Japan was formed. So the other thing that happens right here, that's called a trench, and that is where crust is recycled. So notice we form crust over here in the divergent, but the Earth's not getting bigger and bigger and bigger. It's just one same size. So there's a cycle. Interesting. The Earth has another cycle where the crust gets recycled. So it's recycling the crust at the same rate that it's forming the crust. So the Earth is not getting bigger or smaller. It's an irregular cycle. Pretty cool. Okay. So at this trench, we all know how Japan works. We get lots of earthquakes, lots of volcanic activity, and we get tsunamis. Do we get mountains? Yeah, that's what the island is. It's one big island under the ocean that built up. So if this is our water side view, the plates are causing all this magma to come up and cool and solidify. This little buildup happens over time. It's all underwater, and then boop, pokes up over the water. That's what we see as the island, the part that pokes up. Underneath, it's this seamount. So all over the ocean, there's lots of underwater mountains, but we don't see them because they don't poke up above the ocean, but they're still under there, and they're very tall mountains. Okay, then we have continent to continent collisions, and that gives us really tall mountains. Big yodel yay hee hoo, big mountains like the Himalayas. Which obviously we get a big earthquake from, and we get volcanic activity sometimes. Okay, and then one more thing we get, trying to make this a little bigger, is we get continent to ocean. So what happens is the ocean dives down underneath the continental crust, which kind of buckles up from the pressure. And we have a trench here as well, where we also get to recycle our crust. And then what happens is as this ocean plate goes down, it starts to melt into liquid rock, lava, well, magma because it's inside, and it starts to push up and cool, and so we get these mountains. So we're going to get earthquakes, volcanoes, and mountains. And where this dives down, both for the ocean and for the continental, that's called a subduction zone. Literally just where the crust goes down. Subduction zone. So that's important to know. Let's see, what else do I want to tell you about? Oh, the hotspot, not the Wi-Fi hotspot. Okay, so we have the ocean floor, and we've got a little plume of magma down here, and it starts to rise up. And we talked about this. When magma rises up and starts touching the water, it will cool and solidify into rock. So this happens over time, and it rises and it cools and it rises and it cools and it rises and it cools, and then all of a sudden, just like Japan, oh, we get a little island up here. Only this little magma plume is not at a boundary. It's in the middle of a plate. And so that's what a hot spot is. It's a magma plume that just hot sport. What am I doing? That's where in the middle of a plate, not on a boundary, this little plume shoots up and we get islands cropping up. So that's like Hawaii. And these are on a plate in the middle, so the plate's moving, and that's why Hawaii has several little islands on a chain, because over time they were over this hot spot. So this main island that's over the hot spot right now will move, and we'll get another little island forming, and we'll have another island, Hawaii, of Hawaii. Anyways, as part of the Hawaii chain. Okay, so that is kind of our gist for all the plate tectonics. So hope that makes sense.